the truth is that America has a divided founding. So I want to talk about, there are at least two traditions in American history. So I'll be talking about both of those. So first of all, I want to start out, the founding of America is directly connected to a bald-headed monk named Martin Luther, who in 1517 claimed that Christians could communicate directly with God. They did not need the papacy to intercede for them. Just as the martyr John Hus proclaimed 100 years earlier, Martin Luther declared that it is Scripture, the Word of God, which deserved that central position. Right? We believe that we can read the Bible ourselves, and we can pray, and we have a personal relationship with God. This really comes out of Martin Luther and other people like him. And then, do you all remember, he nailed the 95 Theses on the door in the church in Wittenberg, Germany, really claiming that the Catholic Church had been corrupted and was not really promoting the Word of God. And he really unleashed a spiritual tidal wave that shifted the foundation of Christian faith away from the centralized authority of the Catholic Church to the individual. Now, we're going to fast forward 100 years later, and you have the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were a dissident religious group in England, and they did not agree with the Church of England, which they felt was kind of very formal and external. And so they wanted to worship in a different way. And so they originally actually escaped to Holland. And they were living in Holland, which was very tolerant, but it was also kind of very, a kind of a fallen culture. From their point of view, Holland was not a good place for their children to grow up. So then they hired the 3 boats, ships, to go to America. And so they arrived on November 11th, 1620, after a voyage of 66 days. And they landed at Plymouth, which is part of Cape Cod, near Cape Cod. Now, 13 years before, there was another landing in the United States, and that was in Jamestown, Virginia. And these were people not really motivated by religion. They really came for economic opportunity. In some cases, there were people who were escaping their past and trying to escape to America to make a new start. You could put it that way. Now, both of these colonies, they had a lot of struggle. Many people died, both in Plymouth and also in Jamestown. And actually, maybe I should mention one more thing about let me just mention one more thing about the Pilgrims. I want to mention one more thing. Originally, when the Plymouth they arrived, the Pilgrims, they initially decided that they would basically share everything together, and they would, share all the crops that they tried to grow together, and It didn't work. Let me just put it that way. They actually did not have enough to eat. You can think about this. There were some people. I think that they're expecting maybe the younger pilgrims to work hard to do most of the work in growing the crops, but then no one had personal ownership of any land, and if you worked hard, then you would not get any more than someone who actually did no work. Actually, it did not work, and the governor, Bradford, I believe his name is. He said, "Wait a second, this is not working. We have to change." So what they did was they gave each of the pilgrims their own plot of land. And they said, okay, you have this much land, and what you grow, through your own effort, it's yours. Okay, so they changed completely. And that next year, they actually had a lot of food. And they actually had enough even to share with other people too. Okay, so I mean, in other words, they tried socialism and it didn't work. It's interesting. Now, so going back to the Jamestown colony, they were struggling quite a bit. They had starvation. There's even evidence that there was some cannibalism practiced. It's a very bad situation for them. But anyway, they were able to survive. And then in 1619, there was a ship that came, a Portuguese ship that brought 20 African slaves. They were the first slaves to arrive in America. That was the beginning of the slavery in America. All right, now fast forwarding here. We're going to 150 years later, and there was a confrontation between British troops, which were there, and the colonists. And there was kind of bad feeling and resentment because of certain practices of the British Army. They would come in and take over your house if they needed a place to stay, and the freedoms of the colonists were not really being respected. There were taxes imposed on the colonists, but they had no role in voting for those taxes. So a band of redcoats opened fire on a crowd. This is in Boston. Now this crowd has been pelting them with ice, oyster shells, and broken glass. The soldiers claim to have acted in self-defense. 8 British soldiers and their officer in charge faced charges for murdering 5 colonists. So, and the Patriot propaganda referred to this incident as the Boston Massacre. I'm not really sure if that's I mean, if someone is pelting you with broken glass, I could see why you might be a little bit worried about your own safety. What might happen next. So, but unfortunately, 5 colonists were murdered. Not far from the custom house, the 34-year-old Boston attorney sat in his office and made a difficult decision. Although a devout patriot, John Adams agreed to risk his family's livelihood and defend the British soldiers and the commander in a Boston courtroom. Do you think John Adams was very popular? He was defending the British troops that most of the colonists hated. To me, this is actually a very important point in our history, because even before the Constitution of the United States came into being, there was the idea that the law should be equally applied, that everyone deserves to have, of course, in the Bible it does talk about this, by the way. And if you look at the Hebrew Bible, it says clearly that people shall not be put to death without testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So it implies that there's some kind of trial, even in the Bible, for a long time. In other words, the Judeo-Christian view is that everyone deserves to have the right to self-defense, actually. So, anyway, 6 of the soldiers were acquitted. The other 2 were convicted of manslaughter. So, then there was an incident on the night of April 18th. Hundreds of British troops marched from Boston to nearby Concord to seize an arms cache. They wanted to seize gunpowder and shooting a mechanism that's important for the guns to work. And so Paul Revere, it's a kind of famous story. Paul Revere, he did a midnight ride to warn the other colonials. He was racing to the house of a minister because at that time the church was the key center of the community. So by letting the minister know, then of course the word would spread, right? To the entire community. And then there was a confrontation on Lexington Town Green, you can see up here, where the colonists gathered together, and the British troops, they had to turn around. I guess the colonists had superior firepower, I guess there must have been a lot of colonists that showed up. And this is actually kind of a hidden part of our history, but the British had a plan to repeal the right to have weapons, and they and to confiscate firearms from the colonists. That was their plan in 1777. And this was this was one of the major reasons for the American Revolution. Usually they talk about taxation without representation, but this is actually a major issue for the colonists. And the black-robed clergy had a very key role, and that's important for us to understand. The ministers at that time, they were a little bit different from many ministers today. They were preaching about God-given freedoms for many, many decades before the Revolution. They were really preparing the people to be able to stand up for their freedom. And when the time came to fight, the ministers were the first to grab their musket and show up for battle. Now, 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence, and they knew that if they were defeated, that they would all be executed. So I just want to mention about what happened to them. Okay. So 5 signers were captured by the British as traitors and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons serving the Revolutionary Army. Another had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds or hardships of the Revolutionary War. 24 were lawyers and jurists. 11 were merchants. 9 were farmers and large plantation owners, men of means, well-educated. But they signed the Declaration of Independence knowing that the penalty would be death if they were captured. Now, the founders had a variety of different religious beliefs, but they all held the conviction that they did not want to be controlled by a king. It was not just the English king's authority that founding fathers were rejecting. It was the authority of centralized power itself. And why did they insist upon division of powers into executive, legislative, and judicial branches? They experienced what centralized tyranny was like, and they wanted none of the divine right of kings that was common in Europe. And I want to read a little bit from the Federalist Papers because there was a really big debate in America about the new Constitution. So I'd like to read from Federalist Paper number 47, which is quoting the political philosopher Montesquieu, who's a Christian philosopher. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. Again, were the power of judging joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control. For the judge would then be the legislator. Were it to be joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with all the violence of an oppressor. So they wanted to divide the executive, the president, from the Congress, from the judicial branch. That's why we have divided powers. Now, you could say that this is very inefficient, right? Even with our U.S. Congress, there's the House of Representatives and then there's the Senate, which is very inefficient because the House of Representatives may pass a bill and then the Senate does not pass the same bill. It does not become a law, right? Or the House and Senate may pass a bill, send it to the president to have him sign it, and then he can veto that law, and it never becomes law, right? Or there could be a lawsuit, and even if the law has been passed by the Congress and signed by the president, it could go into the court system, and the Supreme Court could say, this is not constitutional. So the American government is set up to slow down orders from the federal government. And the idea is really a concern that that all of us have the potential to abuse power, right? Now, I'd like to talk about, in many countries around the world, they try to copy the external form of American democracy. I mean, it's ironic. Even in communist countries, they always like their name always is the Democratic Republic of the Democratic Republic. What is North Korea called? What is the name of North Korea? It's the Democrat, isn't it called the Democratic Republic? People's Republic? Okay, all right, whatever. But communists love to use the word republic. It's not a republic, right? Anyway, many countries, they try to copy the external form of American democracy. But then it does not seem to work. So but the framers of America, they knew that a shared culture rooted in Judeo-Christian values biblical values was necessary for a Republican form of government to work. As John Adams, who became our second president, he said that we have no government armed with powers capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So he was saying the Constitution only really works if people have moral values. And you could think about it, if you flip that idea around, the more immoral a people become, then the more government you need to control them, right? Isn't that true? So if we become immoral, then the government has to become more tyrannical to control, people want to be safe. So there was an interesting article written by a kind of a political scientist named Edward Lynch, and his article was called Latin American Democracy is Crumbling Under Corruption. And so he's explaining why many Latin American countries, which it looks like they have a democracy, the people vote for a leader, but they're not doing well. So, economically and many other ways, they're not doing well. So he wrote, constitutional republics need three things to work: trust, hope, and a sense that I have the power to make improvements in my life and in the lives of those I care about. So, and then he says, chaos and corruption destroy these three things. So corruption requires three things: human greed, a monopoly of power, and anonymity. Okay? Centralized bureaucracies breed corruption since they can easily hide their decisions behind a veil of anonymity. Right? If you call a federal agency in Washington, D.C., you might get like a recording or a robot voice. Yeah, your call is important to us, that's right. But you cannot talk to a human being, maybe. But even if you talk to a human being, yeah. So, Centralized bureaucracy destroys trust, hope, and self-autonomy. And it's easy and basically what he's saying is, in many South American countries, it's like this. The government has a lot of power, and the people in power have a lot of connections with the big businesses, and people are mainly motivated to benefit their families and clans, and then they can hide behind, the government authority, and it's hard to find out why nothing's happening. So I'll give you an example. There was a researcher named Hernando de Soto who did an experiment. So he decided, I'm going to how long will it take me to get the permit to start a business in Miami, Florida, and then I'm going to go to Lima, Peru, and see how long it takes me to get the permits from the government in Lima, Peru. So he was able to complete and file all the required permits for a new business in Miami in 1 day. Okay, not that bad, right? Okay, then he went to Lima, Peru. It took him 14 months. And he had to pay 3 bribes. He had to pay off 3 government officials, or it might have taken 14 years. Okay. So, now think about this. If you're an investor and you want to start a new business, where do you want to start a business? In a place like Miami, Florida, or in Lima, Peru? Miami, right? Yeah. Now, on the other hand, if you're part of the inner circle in Peru and you're connected with people in the government, maybe you want to start a business there because you know that all the competitors will be shut out, right? But for new people who want to start a new business, who don't come from a rich, influential family, Miami, Florida is a lot better, right? That's why people want to come to America. That's the difference. In America, traditionally it's been that it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter who you're connected to. If you go to the government office, you fill out the paperwork. You may have to pay some type of fee, which is not that much usually, and you can get started. You can start your own business, a beauty salon, a restaurant, various kinds of businesses. Now, I have to say that this is changing. In many states, like in California, they have so many environmental regulations and so on. It's really becoming, and you have to do environmental impact studies and so on. In leftist Democrat-run states, it's becoming more difficult. But generally speaking, the reason why people want to come, look, people are leaving countries which are very beautiful countries. Those people, they don't want to leave their country. They love their family, their friends. They've grown up in a certain country. It's natural for them to stay. But they know that because there's no real freedom in those countries, they have no future, right? That's why they want to come to America. But it's not like, there are reasons why there's limited government. And my point is, the limited government is linked to a biblical view of human beings. Everyone has value, but also everyone has sin. Those are kind of the two main ideas. Now I want to talk about America's original sin. Several of the founding fathers owned slaves. And people are right to say, well, America, you think that you're the land of the free, but you allowed slavery. And that is true. That is true. And so I want to talk about that directly, about that issue. So first of all, I want to take a step back and talk about the larger context of slavery in the world. Slavery has a 5,000-year-old history in the world. So slavery operated in the first civilizations, such as the Sumer in Mesopotamia, which dates back as far as 3500 BC. Slavery was widespread in the ancient world, including Egypt, Babylon, Persian, Greek, and the Roman Empire. It became less common throughout Europe during the early Middle Ages. The Byzantine-Ottoman Wars, 1265 to 1479, and the Ottoman Wars in Europe, basically wars between Islam and Christianity, resulted in the capture of large numbers of Christian slaves from Europe. So then we have to look at 12 centuries of Muslim slavery. 12 to 14 million slaves were held over 12 centuries in the Muslim world. The Arab slave trade encompassed mainly Western and Central Asia, Northern Eastern Africa, India, and Europe from the 7th to the 20th century. There are many books about Islam's 1 million white slaves, basically from 1530 to 1780. So the President Thomas Jefferson, our third president, he sent the Marines to fight against the Barbary pirates. They were Muslim pirates. And he tried to negotiate with them, and they basically were not interested because they were making a lot of money from white slaves. And they would capture American ships, and they would enslave the American sailors, American citizens. So we actually had to fight a war against those pirates. Now I want to talk about the slave trade from Africa to the Americas from 1650 to 1860. So we can see about 300,000 slaves from Africa were sent up to Europe, and we see here that 500,000 African slaves arrived in the colonies, and then 200,000 were sent to Central America, and then 500,000 were sent to this part of South America. And then there were 4.5 million slaves sent to the West Indies, and 5 million African slaves were sent to Brazil. So the reality is that the reason I'm mentioning this is, America had original sin to have slavery. But this was part of a very, very large worldwide sin. The people who are talking about slavery, the history of slavery here in America, Did they ever mention about the 5 million African slaves sent to Brazil? No. Or the 4.5 million that were sent to the Caribbean? No. So their view is like a very narrow. And why is that? It's because they're really not interested in this issue. They just want to use it to accuse America, essentially, and make people angry at our country. Now, I want to talk briefly about the struggle to end slavery in the British Empire. The Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade was a British abolitionist group formed in 1787 by 12 men who gathered together at a printing shop in London. The society worked to educate the public about the abuses of the slave trade. So you can see this was their symbol or their seal. Am I not a man and a brother? Now, what do you think this term brother, what do you think it means? The only way that you would consider a black slave to be your brother is if you're a Christian, right? There's no other viewpoint by which you would say, oh, he is my brother, except if you believe that we have the same Father, which is God, right? These were Christians. These were not Buddhists. They were not Confucianists. They were not Muslims who started the abolition movement. They were Christians. Now, they persuaded a British Christian member of parliament to take on the cause of the abolition of slavery. And he headed the campaign in the British Parliament against the British slave trade for 20 years. Think about this. He spent 20 years trying to get this law passed against the slave trade. And finally, in 1807, they passed the Slave Trade Act of 1807. It banned the trade of slaves in the British Empire. But it didn't abolish slavery. So they stopped the slave trade, but they did not end slavery. And that took until an act passed in 1833, and then by 1838, slavery was abolished in the British Empire, except for India, which they had their own indigenous slavery practice. So, except for India, it ended it throughout the British Empire, which was huge, right? Huge. Okay. So now I want to talk about the abolition of slavery worldwide. And so we're going to start in the light blue is the year 1000 AD to 1750. Slavery and serfdom was ended in Russia in 1723. And you can see here, the slavery was abolished in many northern European countries in the 13th and 14th century. Then the light green is 1750 to 1799, and so slavery was abolished in what now we call Alaska, parts of Canada. You see, this looks like Portugal, 1761. And then 1800 to 1849, you can see that it was abolished throughout Canada. You can see here. In Mexico, it was abolished there. Let me see, is that Chile? I think that's Chile right there. And this is South Africa. It was abolished in 1834. So this basically the British Empire. You can see here the British Empire, parts of the British Empire, it was abolished. After that, the slavery, the act I just showed you, the abolition of slavery in 1838. It was ended in the British Empire. All right. Then 1850 to 1889, you can see here that it was abolished. In the United States, it was abolished after the Civil War, 1865. And these were probably Western territories, 1862. During the Civil War. And then you can see here that it was abolished in many Latin American countries in the 1850s. In Brazil, 1888. And this is, I'm not sure which country this is. Angola? Okay. All right. And then let's jump 1900 to 1949. Is the the red. So here we see that it was abolished in the early 1900s. It was abolished in these African countries in the 1900s. You can see, and in Asia, you can see 1910, 1926, 1958. We'll be looking at the issue of slavery in China in a few minutes. And then 1950 to 1999, you can see there are certain African countries that abolished slavery in 1981, 1960, 1962 is Saudi Arabia. So quite late. So the struggle to end slavery has taken basically almost like 1,000 years. We still have slavery right now, actually. But my point is, it's been a long battle. And there's only one religion or worldview that really clearly says that every human being has absolute value. And that is Judeo-Christian view of human beings, that we're all born from same human ancestors, right? So, all right. Now, Muslim slavery in the 20th century. Slavery was abolished in the Ottoman Empire in 1924. Slavery was abolished in Iran in 1929. Yeah, and then you can see these other countries, which I mentioned already. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, 1962. Under pressure from Britain, Oman in 1970, Mauritania in 1905, and then actually Mauritania, it was abolished several times. It looks like it didn't quite work. And in many cases, the British Navy was actually involved. Great Britain was trying to force these other countries to end slavery, actually. So in this photo here, you see an Arab slave merchant with a female slave in 1864. Now, I want to talk about slavery in Africa today. Slavery claiming the sanction of Islam is practiced today in Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Libya, and Sudan. Traditional slavery exists in parts of Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Nigeria. Slavery involving human trafficking and enslavement of child soldiers and child laborers is practiced today in Angola, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, Gabon, and Cameroon. It's also practiced in territories controlled by Islamic rebel groups. So much of it is linked to the Islamic countries. Now, this is terrible, of course, but there's something that is even worse than slavery, which is the execution of infidels by Islamic extremists. These are Coptic Christians in Egypt. And they were given a chance to renounce their faith or to be executed. And they chose not to renounce Jesus Christ. And so they were I guess their throats were cut. So this is going on right now. The persecution of Christians in North Africa and the Middle East is horrible right now. So I would like to ask you to read this together with me. So please read this. The rod of iron is only to protect the kingdom, not to impose it. Okay, I want to read it one more time. The rod of iron is only to protect the kingdom, not to impose it. I just want to emphasize this like 1,000 million times, okay? Because we believe that we have a God-given right for self-defense, right? That's what 2 King is teaching us. And I believe that too. But we need to always remember that it's not to impose our beliefs on other people. The Constitution of Chanelguk, like the American Constitution, guarantees freedom of religion. That means people can believe whatever they want, or they can believe nothing. They are not forced to believe anything. Because we believe that to have a real relationship with God, it has to be freely chosen. If someone is forcing you to believe something, then it's not sincere, right? So I think this is so important for the future of the Rod of Iron Kingdom. Okay. Also, I want to talk about slavery in Asia today. 25 million men, women, and children live in slavery in Asia and the Pacific. North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan have the highest prevalence percentage of their population in slavery. India, China, and Pakistan have the highest absolute numbers of enslaved people living in modern slavery. Here's an article about the roughly 500,000 Tibetans who are in forced labor camps in China, and there are 1 million Uyghurs. They're Muslims, and they are also in these forced labor camps, which is essentially slavery. North Korea, okay, this satellite imagery taken in 2016 shows the Sinuiju concentration camp in North Korea, one of the re-education camps for people accused of political and economic crimes. So there's an estimated 2.6 million modern slaves in North Korea right now. Now, I want to play a video for you. I think you'll find it interesting.
The remarkable story of a young woman's escape from North Korea.
In order to protect me, I saw my mother raped.
Defectors shared new details of the regime's brutality.
You can't even imagine it.
The North Korean regime denied this.
Kim Jong-un is a murderer.
The dictatorship is so incensed by what she's saying that they want her tracked down.
Pyongyang fired back with angry rhetoric,
outright calling her a liar.
Korea will strike a lethal blow.
Saying the wrong thing could execute me.
Regurgitate the regime's propaganda.
Kim Jong-un is the embodiment of our destiny.
It becomes impossible to determine what's real and what's staged.
Only people who escape can give us the truth.
I escaped when I was 13 years old.
The fact that she survived, it's nothing short of a miracle.
1 to 2 million people died, with dead bodies filling the streets.
one of the worst human rights crises of our time.
It only took 3 generations.
Violating every conceivable human right.
Deliberate use of starvation as a means of control.
I didn't know what freedom was. I escaped for a bowl of rice.
How did you escape when you were just 13 years old?
Growing up in North Korea, my father was sent to labor camp for engaging in illegal trading. He was selling clocks, sugar, rice, and later copper to feed us.
The government just arrest them, torture them, and send them to prison. And he went to labor camp for 10 years.
We are starving, but I could see the lights from China at night. And I wondered, if I go where the light is, I might be able to find a bowl of rice. So it was the only option for us.
My mother and I found a lady who told us they can send us to China. And we climbed the mountain. We crossed the frozen river. We cannot just cross anywhere because the border guards watching us and they will shoot us. We bribed the border guards, but we cannot bribe every guard because 100 meters, guards, and the dog was like barking. So somebody would shoot us from there. I thought I was gonna be shot. It was very scary. And luckily we didn't get shot. We made it to China.
When I escaped to China, we found out that we had to be sold to live in China.
You were sold to a man and you really resisted giving in to him for a long time, physically fighting in order to survive.
Yeah, that was the last moment I remember I was being a kid and I had to be an adult.
My mother was being sold for $65. I was sold for over $200. I was more expensive than her because I was virgin and I was young because I was 13.
And the man who bought me, he was a broker, but he told me if I become his mistress, he would buy my mom, buy my father. And I thought if I sacrifice myself, I can see my family again. And that's how I became mistress.
My father was around 45 years old. He'd been tortured so much in prison camp in North Korea. In China, we could not go to hospital to treat him. So he had to just die. Now thinking that I never realized how young he was. Until he was dying, he told me that you have to one thing promise me, that you are never going to kill yourself. Because he told me life is a gift that I should never give up.
My father died, and I had to bury his ashes in the middle of my mountain, and I was 14 years old at that time.
In 2009, my mother and I were rescued by Christian missionaries who led us to Mongolian border with China.
And then we walked and crossed the Gobi Desert. The moment I stood on the desert, sand, just straight. It's endless, and I felt only the stars were with me. It was 2009 and it was end of February or beginning of March, so it was freezing cold. So we were crossing the wire fences and we were crawling and walking and running, and we followed the compass. And then later we connect with compass, so we follow the stars north. And I was so thankful because I met somebody in the desert. That thank you. I was speaking Chinese. Say. And then we flew to South Korea. The very first day when I got out from the resettlement center, the happiest thing was having food. And I remember how my father tortured. And my father died without knowing even this kind of democracy exists in the world. He didn't even know this much food was available in the world.
Now, I live in the United States as a free person. Thank you. I am at Columbia University right now. I'm only 24 years old. I am married to an American. I have a 6-month-old son.
Along my journey, I have seen the horrors that humans can inflict on another. But I've also witnessed acts of tenderness and kindness and sacrifice in the worst imaginable circumstances. I know that it is possible to lose part of your humanity in order to survive. But I also know that the spark of human dignity is never completely extinguished, and that given the oxygen of freedom and the power of love, it can grow again.
Be free. From my experience, literally everything is possible. Now I'm here, and that is why I believe in miracles. Nothing is forever in this world. And I say, we have every reason to be hopeful.
It's pretty meaningful, yeah. But, you know, the truth is that on November 3rd, the American people will make a choice about whether America will stand up, continue to stand as a place of freedom, or whether we will choose leadership that is very close like this with communist China. We actually have a very clear choice, I would say. So now I just want to quickly discuss the long road to eradicate slavery in the United States. So there was a strong anti-slavery movement throughout the early 1800s. So there were people like Harriet Tubman. She herself escaped from slavery, but then she returned to Maryland in 1850 as the Underground Railroad conductor. She rescued over 70 slaves until the outbreak of the Civil War. There's a really interesting movie about her if you want to, she's very inspiring. She joined the Union Army as a nurse, but she also acted as a scout and a spy behind enemy lines. And she worked with the Union Colonel James Montgomery to free over 700 slaves in the raid on Conbally Ferry in South Carolina. Then there was someone named William Lloyd Garrison, who was the founder of the anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. And he fought for many, many decades to educate and awaken people as to the sin of slavery. So he said, what an idiotic absurdity it is to say that earnest, persistent, uncompromising moral opposition to a system of boundless immorality is the way to strengthen it, and that the way to abolish such a system is to say nothing about it. People are telling him, keep your mouth shut, don't say anything about this. Then there are people like Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery himself, came to the North, And he began to speak out. So here's one of his quotes. "No man could put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened around his own neck." So he was he started his own newspaper, and he spoke all over the North. So there was a lot of effort being made. And then also there was the author Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this was a bestseller throughout the United States, at least in the North, I would say. And it really awakened people to, more personally connect to the reality of slavery. And when President Lincoln met her, he said, "Oh, here's a woman who is responsible for starting the Civil War." So unfortunately, those efforts to change slavery peacefully did not succeed. Basically, all the northern states ended slavery soon after the Constitution was signed. I think Vermont did it before they signed the Constitution, but the rest basically abolished it within 10 years in the North. But unfortunately, we had to fight a war. 620,000 people died in the Civil War. I think that's more than 1 in 10 people. There's a huge number of people who died. Now, after the Civil War, there were blacks in the South who actually were being elected to Congress and to different offices, but there was a secret organization called the Ku Klux Klan that was founded in 1865 by Confederate soldiers in collaboration with the Democrat Party. And they used violent intimidation to basically intimidate blacks to stay in their place, basically. And also, the first gun control laws in America were basically to prevent black people from having guns. It's very interesting. Gun control, if you look at, particularly in the South, they did not want black people to have the ability to defend themselves. Then there were many laws passed to prevent black people, to make it hard for black people to vote. There was segregation in terms of like bathrooms and even water fountains, swimming pools. Everything was separate. Transportation, there was different railroad cars were whites only and black people only. So, actually, there are a lot of capitalists who didn't like segregation because it's more expensive. You need to have twice as many train cars because it makes no sense, right? And then I am going to show you a picture, which is a very ugly picture to see, but I think you should see it. I'm just warning you about it. There were Southern lynching parties from 1819 to 1960. According to the National Association, NAACP figures, between 1896 and 1960, 5,200 blacks were burned, shot, or mutilated by lynch mobs. The death toll probably is even higher because in many cases sheriffs and local officials didn't consider it to be important enough to report all of the murders. So there was systemic racism in this country. There's no question about it. Okay. So this is part of our history that it is. Well, yeah, the Democrat Party actually was involved with all of this in the South. That's true. That is true. Okay. Now, at the very same time that we have this kind of horrible thing going on, you know, the worst part about this picture is that these are white people gathered to watch. To me, that's the horrible, most horrible part of this photo is they're watching. They're probably jeering and happy to see this. So, but at the very same time, when this horrible things were happening, you also saw stories like of Madam C.J. Walker. She married and had children quite young as a teenager, and her husband died when she was 20 years old. So she was a widow, and then she went to work doing laundry. Very humble, right? But she experienced hair loss. She was losing her hair, I guess, at a young age. Now, I was thinking about her. I was thinking, wow, you know, she's had a rough life. She's a single mother. Her husband's dead. She's losing her hair. She could easily become a very resentful person, I think, right? God, why do you hate me, right? But instead, she said, after seeking treatment for hair loss, she developed the Walker system and sold her homemade products directly to black women. A talent for self-promotion helped build a booming enterprise. And she became the first black woman millionaire in America. So, America is a complicated, complex place, right? You have these horrible racist murders going on, covered up by local governments, and the federal government not wanting to do much about it, actually, for a long time. And then you also have someone with almost literally nothing able to become a very, very wealthy woman. Then I'm jumping forward now into 1900s. So during World War II, you know, many black Americans, they fought in World War II against Nazism, and they came back and they said, well, I'm fighting against Nazism in Germany, but how free am I in my own country? And so many people are saying we're no longer willing to wait to have our full rights, voting rights, and to end segregation. And you can see, if you look in the photo, you can see the black teenager, and you have these white policemen with these barking dogs. And, you know, think about this. These were mostly black, many young people, actually many black young people. They were willing to march through the middle of the local, you know, Selma and other locations, and they knew that this is what they would face. And someone pointed out to me a few days ago that the night before they would meet in the churches, and they would be praying and singing Christian hymns and really praying for what they would have to do the next day. The civil rights movement in America was deeply rooted in the church, in the Christian churches. So some of you who were involved with the American Leadership Conference you may know that Ralph Abernathy, who was one of the main leaders under Martin Luther King, he came and spoke at our conferences many, many times, right? So here you see a little girl named Ruby Bridges. She was escorted by U.S. Marshals to attend an all-white school in 1960. She was the first African-American child to desegregate an all-white elementary school in Louisiana. So there was a lot of struggles to end desegregation in the schools. And then I believe I read, this is a statement from Martin Luther King. I showed this quote, I think in the first lecture. But let's read it again. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So he was saying there's this promise made by the founders, and I'm here to cash a check, right? And the American people agreed with him. But it took people who were willing to march and confront the racism through nonviolence. Now, do you know there are some people, there are some blacks who said, wait a second, these white racists, they're willing to use barking dogs, even to murder blacks. There was a famous church, I forget the name of the church, where a bomb killed 4 of the girls in that church, the black church. So there are some blacks that say, okay, they're killing us. Why? We're gonna get back. We're gonna kill them. Now, if the nonviolent movement, if this civil rights movement, if they had resorted to violence, and do you think it would have succeeded? No. The American people said, look, okay, well, these white racists, they may be violent, but you're violent too. You're murdering people too. So there was a lot of self-control that was needed by the civil rights movement. I think that's important for us to remember too. We're confronting communists right now in America, and some of them are using violence. But we have to be careful to not use the rod of iron unless absolutely necessary. Because the stupidest thing that we could do is for someone who believes in freedom and the right to bear arms, the stupidest thing that we could do would be to use our rod of iron to kill someone on the other side. That would just discredit our whole cause, don't you think so? Absolutely. So because of the civil rights movement, protests, the American people saw this on national television, and their conscience was struck. And there's a lot of pressure to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. You can see Martin Luther King behind President Johnson. It was passed with the support of almost all the Republicans. So it would not have passed without Republican support. Now, I want to shift to talk about the increasing acceptance of interracial marriage in the United States. So you can see that in 2010, only 24% of those surveyed agreed that interracial marriage is a good thing. But by 2017, it increased to 39%. Okay, so a significant increase in people thinking interracial marriage is a good idea. Here we see the dramatic drop in the share of non-blacks who would oppose a relative marrying a black person. So in 1990, 63% of those surveyed, mostly white people, they opposed one of their relatives to marry a black person. But in 2016, that has dropped to 14%. A huge shift in attitudes among the American people. Here, there are increasing rates of interracial marriage. We can see here only 3% of newlyweds in 1967 had intermarriage, and that's increased to 17% in 2015. And you can see a sharp increase of interracial marriage with blacks from 5% up to 18%. The rates among Asians and Hispanics is already higher. Yeah, so there's been a big increase in interracial marriage. And I heard a rumor that there is this weird church that believes that interracial marriage is a pretty good idea. It might just be a rumor, but that's what I've heard.